My name is Rachel Foster, and I am 27 years old, and 7 years ago my own mother told my aunt, over the phone, in a voice she did not realize carried into the next room, that she did not think a church with a full band behind the pulpit could actually be worshiping God the way Scripture described it. 2 Sundays ago, that same woman sat in the third row of my church, the one she had visited maybe half a dozen times in her whole life, and asked if she could come back the following week too, because she said she had not been able to stop thinking about the second song. I want to tell you about the 7 years in between, because I know some of you have been told the way you worship does not count the same way somebody else's does, and I do not think we hear enough about how a story like that can actually end. Before I go any further, I want you to remember one small thing for me, because it comes back later, and I promise I will return to it. The cassette tape my mother still keeps in her kitchen drawer, a recording of our whole extended family singing a cappella at my grandfather's funeral 30 years ago, no instrument, just voices, layered and imperfect, and somehow more beautiful for it. Hold on to that tape. It matters more than you would think. If you have ever loved a way of worship that somebody in your family decided did not count as real worship at all, this one is for you. Go ahead and subscribe and tell me in the comments where you are listening from, because I read every single one. Let me take you back to a Sunday afternoon in Fenwick, Arkansas, a small town about 30 minutes outside Little Rock, and to the day I first understood exactly where I stood with my own mother, Linda Coyle. I grew up at Fenwick Church of Christ, a plain building with a gravel lot and a single wooden cross over the door. No piano, no organ, nothing but human voices raised together every single Sunday. A sound I still find more moving than almost anything else I have ever heard. Layered harmonies rising up out of a room with nothing to hide behind. I remember, as a girl, standing between my parents during the closing hymn most Sundays, feeling the whole room's voices settle into harmony around me, no instrument to lean on, nothing but the plain fact of everyone singing together, and I have never once, in the years since, stopped loving that particular sound, even as I came to love a fuller one alongside it. My father, Gerald, has served as an elder there for over 20 years, a careful, precise man who reads Scripture the way you would examine a legal document, checking every reference twice before he will build a single conclusion on it. My mother led the ladies' Bible class for as long as I can remember, and she believed, with her whole heart, that worship without an instrument was not simply her own preference but a matter of scriptural precedent, a conviction she held the same steady way you hold something that has never once been questioned in your entire life. Fenwick itself is the kind of town where everybody still waves from their porch. A single Harps grocery store, a Sonic drive-in that serves as the unofficial meeting place for half the county's teenagers, and 4 churches for a population under 4,000. Which tells you most of what you need to know about how seriously that particular corner of Arkansas takes its Sundays. My mother has run that ladies' Bible class in the same fellowship hall, with the same folding tables, for over 25 years, and I do not think there is a single family in that congregation she has not personally brought a casserole to at some point in their lives, sick or grieving or simply new to town. I work as a physical therapist at a clinic just outside Little Rock, a job I have held for going on 5 years now, and though it has nothing obvious to do with this story, I have thought more than once about how much of what carried me through the years I am about to tell you about came from the same instinct that makes a good therapist, the patience to work with someone through slow, incremental progress, trusting the body eventually to heal in its own time, rather than expecting it to move faster than it is ready to. I met Ben Foster during my junior year of college, in a study group for an anatomy class neither one of us particularly enjoyed, and what I noticed first about him was the quiet, deliberate way he asked questions, rather than assuming he already understood something. An instinct I would later understand runs through nearly everything he does. We started getting coffee after our study sessions, terrible vending machine coffee from the machine outside the science building, and somewhere around the 6th or 7th week, he told me plainly that he had grown up at River City Fellowship, that his own faith had always felt most alive to him in a room full of raised hands and a band playing loud enough that you could feel it in your chest, and that he had never once had reason to question whether that particular fullness of sound was somehow lesser than a quieter kind of devotion. I told him about Fenwick Church of Christ, the voices alone, the particular weight of a whole congregation singing without anything to hide behind, and he told me that sounded like its own kind of beautiful, and I told him his church sounded alive in a different way, and neither one of us meant it as an insult, and for a long while that was enough. We talked, that same evening, about whether either of us could imagine giving up our own tradition entirely for the others, and neither one of us could, honestly, and I remember thinking that was itself a kind of relief, that we were not building a relationship on the assumption one of us would eventually convert the other, only on the hope that two different rooms of the same house could somehow learn to share a single family. We dated close to 2 years, careful and unhurried, the way both of us had been raised to approach most things, and by the time he asked to meet my parents properly, I already loved him enough that I did not think anything short of outright cruelty could have changed my mind. I brought Ben home to Fenwick about 5 months into dating him, and my mother was polite, correct, asked him about his own family, complimented the peach cobbler he had brought, which I have since learned is apparently required in every Arkansas kitchen, regardless of which side of the state you grew up on. It was over dessert that she asked him, warmly enough, what his own church's Sunday service looked like, and he told her, honestly, describing the band, the volume, the way the whole room sang together, and I watched her face do something small and careful before she said, well, that sounds like quite a production, and turned the conversation to the weather. My father, sitting across the table, asked Ben a different set of questions entirely, about his own family's history, about what he studied in school, about whether he had ever considered what kind of father he hoped to become someday, and Ben answered each one thoughtfully, and I remember thinking, even that first afternoon, that my father was a man who filled a room with genuine curiosity as a matter of instinct, the same way my mother filled it with something closer to careful evaluation. Ben proposed the following spring, on the porch of the house where I grew up, no grand production, simply telling me he could not picture a single good year ahead of him without me standing in the middle of it. I said yes before he had finished the sentence. He had asked my father for his blessing the week before, an old-fashioned gesture I did not learn about until years later, and my father told him yes on one condition, that he never once asked me to be quieter about my faith than I already was. Ben told him that was the easiest promise he had ever made, and he has kept it faithfully every year since, even through the hardest stretches with my mother. He called my parents that same evening. My father was gracious, warm even, told Ben he was glad to welcome him into the family. My mother waited until my father had hung up, then called me back separately and asked, before congratulations, before anything else, whether we had discussed which church we would attend once we married. I told her we had not settled everything yet, which was true. She was quiet a moment, then said, well, I do hope you will think on it hard, Rachel. This is not a small thing. It was not a slammed door, but it was not a warm one either, and I told myself it would soften with time. I did not yet understand, that spring, how long a time my mother had been counting. We married at River City Fellowship, with my father walking me down the aisle and offering a brief, gracious blessing during the ceremony that my mother's own pastor from Fenwick had helped him prepare. She sat in the fourth pew, hands folded, and during the first song, when the whole band came in together, drums and guitar, and nearly 200 voices raised at once, I watched her stay perfectly still, watching the stage the way you watch a spectacle you have already decided, in advance, not to be moved by. At the reception, she hugged me and told me the ceremony was lovely, and I believe she meant it, in her own careful way. That is the thing about my mother that took me years to understand. She never once lied to me across this whole story. She simply believed, with total sincerity, that the particular shape of worship I had chosen was a step away from something Scripture required, and she never fully separated that conviction from her love for me, even when the two pulled against each other. My father found me during the first dance and told me, quietly, that he had watched my mother study the whole ceremony the way she studies a Scripture passage she is not yet sure how to reconcile, and that he wanted me to know he did not see River City the same careful way she did, that he had decided, watching Ben grow up alongside our own church community over the 2 years we dated, that any young man who asked such careful, respectful questions about a faith not his own was exactly the kind of husband he had hoped I would find. The rehearsal dinner the night before, hosted at my parents' house, was short and sharp, and I want to tell it to you exactly the way it happened, because it is the hinge this whole story turns on. My mother stood to welcome everyone, thanked both families for coming, and then said, warmly enough on the surface, that she hoped Rachel and Ben would build their marriage on worship that Scripture could actually account for, not simply whatever felt good in the moment, and let the sentence sit there a beat too long before moving on to the blessing over the meal. The table went quiet the particular length of time it takes a room to decide whether anyone will say something. Nobody did. My own father looked down at his plate, and I understood, in that single sentence, exactly what the years ahead were going to look like. I did not sleep well that night, lying awake in my childhood bedroom replaying the sentence over and over, trying to decide whether I had imagined the particular weight in her voice when she said the words, whatever felt good in the moment, or whether everyone at that table had heard exactly what I had heard. Ben called me before he went to bed himself, and I told him what I was turning over, and he was quiet for a moment before saying only, I heard it too, and I should have said something, and did not, and I am sorry, and I remember thinking, even through my own hurt, that at least he had noticed, even if noticing was not yet the same thing as standing beside me. I did not know yet that this same careful, precise sentence, dressed up as a hope for our marriage, was the exact conviction I would watch her quietly set down, 7 years later, sitting in a pew in my own sanctuary, during a song with a full band behind it. The first 2 years of our marriage, the distance lived in small omissions rather than large ones. We drove out to Fenwick most Sundays after our own service let out, and my mother was unfailingly correct with me, asked after my work at the clinic, discussed the weather and the Razorbacks, and the price of gasoline at reasonable length, and never once asked me a single real question about what worship at River City actually felt like from the inside. There was a comment at a family cookout in our second year, from my own aunt, kind and genuinely curious, asking what it was like having a full band up front during a service, and before I could answer, my mother said, from across the yard, without quite looking up, that she supposed it was easier to feel something with all that noise behind you, though she was not sure feeling and worshipping were always the same thing, and laughed a small laugh with no real warmth in it. The table went quiet, and then somebody asked about the potato salad, and we all let them. My aunt found me alone in the kitchen a little later, refilling the sweet tea pitcher, and told me quietly that she thought my mother's comment had not been fair, and that she herself had always found something moving about a full band, having attended a similar church herself years before marrying into the Coyle family, and that she had simply never worked up the nerve to say so out loud at a Fenwick gathering. I told her I appreciated her saying it to me privately, even if she had not said it at the table, and she squeezed my hand and told me some battles are not worth fighting in front of an audience, and I have thought of that particular kindness many times since, a small act of quiet solidarity that cost her nothing publicly but meant everything to me privately. If you have ever had a parent draw a quiet line between how you worship and whether you are really worshiping at all, I want you to know I understand exactly how lonely that particular distinction can feel. Stay with me, because there is a turn coming, and if you have not already, go ahead and subscribe so you do not miss where this one lands. Ben heard the comment that day. He said nothing, and I will tell you honestly that in that exact moment I was angrier at my husband than at my own mother, because she was only being who she had always been, and he was the one who had spent his whole life learning to let these moments pass rather than stand inside them. There was a smaller moment that same year that stayed with me longer than the cookout did, mostly because nobody else ever saw it happen. I came home from a visit to Fenwick one Sunday to find my mother had, without asking, brought our infant son a small Church of Christ hymnal for his own bookshelf, no instrument notation in it at all, and inside the front cover she had written, "For when he is old enough to sing the way it was always meant to be sung." I never told her how that line landed, and I have decided, over the years, that not telling her was its own particular kind of ache. There was another quiet incident that same year, one I have never told anyone outside of Ben. My mother had always been the one asked to say the blessing at every extended family gathering, and when my aunt hosted that year's reunion, she asked me, instead, gently, whether I would like to say it, since I had married in, and it might be nice to include both traditions. I agreed, glad for the gesture, and prayed a short, plain prayer, nothing performed, nothing borrowed from River City's style at all. My mother thanked me afterward, correctly, but I noticed she volunteered, without being asked, to say the blessing at every single gathering after that one, and I understood, without either of us discussing it, that she had not entirely trusted what a prayer from my own mouth, in my own words, might actually sound like in front of the rest of the family. I mentioned this particular incident to my sister once, wondering aloud whether I was reading too much into a single small gesture, and she told me she did not think I was, that she had noticed the same pattern herself over the years, our mother quietly reclaiming any role that might have let the rest of the family see me lead in a way she had not first approved of, and that she believed it came from the same old fear, rather than any real malice, though she agreed that did not make it feel any less lonely from where I was standing. Our son Caleb was born in our 3rd year, and my mother held him at the hospital and cried real tears and told me he was beautiful, and I believed every word, because a new grandson was the one thing in this entire story nobody in it ever pretended not to love completely. When it came time to plan Caleb's dedication, my mother asked, gently enough, whether we might consider having it done at Fenwick instead, since the Church of Christ did not practice infant dedication the way River City did. But she said she would feel more at peace, knowing he had at least been prayed over in the building where his own grandfather served as an elder. I told her, just as gently, that we planned to have him dedicated at River City, since that was our church, the one we attended, the one where we served, but that she and my father would always be welcome to come pray over him there, or at home, any time she wished. She was quiet a long moment, and then said only, "We will see," and passed me the sweet tea, and that was the whole conversation, and it told me everything about how far apart we still stood, because we agreed completely on what we wanted for our son, and she still did not believe I was capable of giving it to him, inside a building she did not fully trust. There was a Christmas that same year where my mother, saying the blessing over the meal herself as she always did, thanked God for a family that worshipped him the way he had always intended, and looked, briefly, just for half a second, at me when she said it. And I sat through the rest of that dinner, with my jaw so tight, I gave myself a headache. I remember driving home that night, Ben's hand finding mine over the console, neither one of us saying much of anything, and I remember thinking, somewhere on that dark highway, that I did not know how many more of these particular headaches I had left in me, and also that I did not yet know how to imagine simply walking away from a table my mother had set every Christmas of my entire life. I want to tell you about a quieter incident, one nobody else saw. I came into my mother's kitchen early one Sunday to help her before the family arrived, and she asked me, almost offhandedly, whether I ever worried the noise at River City made it harder to actually hear God, rather than easier. I told her, plainly, that I found the opposite true, that the fullness of the sound helped me feel the size of what we were singing about, rather than distracting from it. She nodded like she had heard me, and never brought it up again, and never once, in all the years after, asked me to sing alongside her at Fenwick, though I offered, gently, more than once. Here is what those 7 years actually looked like from the inside, and I want to tell you honestly, because I do not think it is fair to make it sound tidier than it was. I never once argued scripture with my mother, never quoted a verse back at her over a holiday table to prove a point about instruments. I simply kept living the ordinary shape of my own faith in front of her, praying quietly at home most mornings, teaching Caleb his own prayers in words he could understand, a steady, unremarkable devotion with nothing dramatic about it at all. There was a particular rhythm to those middle years that I only recognized once they were behind me. I worked long shifts at the clinic, and I came home most evenings to a house that needed the ordinary maintenance of any young family, and my own devotions, most days, looked like nothing more than a few quiet minutes at the kitchen table before Caleb woke, coffee going cold, a chapter read half awake, a prayer said in plain, unremarkable words. I want to tell you honestly that none of it felt impressive in the moment. It simply felt like the shape of my days, the same unglamorous discipline my own father had modeled for me my whole childhood, reading scripture the way you would examine something you intended to actually live by, not simply admire from a distance. There was a season, sometime in our 4th year, where I very nearly stopped trying at all. I drove to my own sister's house one Wednesday afternoon, with Caleb asleep in his car seat, and told her I was tired, clean through, of being measured against a worship style I had never once claimed was the only right one. My sister let me finish, then told me something I have never forgotten. She said, "Rachel, I do not think Mom is actually afraid of your church. I think she is afraid that if the way she worships is not the only right way, then some part of the certainty she has built her whole life on might not hold either, and she has needed yours to look wrong, so she never has to ask that question about her own. That does not make it fair, but it might help you carry it." My sister, who left Fenwick herself years before I did, for a Methodist congregation 2 towns over, told me she had walked a milder version of this same road with our mother, and that the coldness had eventually softened for her too, though it had taken nearly as long and never came with quite the dramatic turn mine eventually did. She said, "Mom is not trying to lose you, Rachel. She is trying to hold on to a version of certainty that has never once been tested this closely before, and testing it scares her more than she knows how to say out loud." River City Fellowship itself meets in a converted warehouse on the edge of downtown Little Rock. Exposed brick and string lights and a stage built by volunteers from the congregation itself. Nearly 600 people filling 3 services every Sunday. A young, energetic staff and a genuine, unpretentious warmth that drew me in from my very first visit with Ben, long before I understood how different it would look to the family I had grown up inside. There was one week, near the end of our 5th year, where I genuinely wondered whether I had somehow imagined all of it, whether 7 years of careful distance was actually a story I had built around a handful of unkind comments that meant less than I believed they did. I mentioned this to my own pastor at River City during a counseling session Ben and I had scheduled for something else entirely, half expecting him to reassure me that my hurt was justified, and instead he asked me a question I did not expect. He asked whether I had ever once told my mother directly, plainly, how a particular comment had actually landed, rather than simply absorbing it and calling the absorbing patience. I admitted I had not, and he told me that patience without honesty sometimes curdles into something closer to martyrdom, which helps no one, least of all the person doing the absorbing, and that faithfulness did not require me to pretend a wound did not exist, only to keep loving the person who had caused it while it healed. He asked me, that same afternoon, whether I had considered that my mother's own certainty about worship might be quietly frightened by the very fullness she kept accusing River City's services of lacking substance underneath. That a woman who had built her entire spiritual identity around one particular sound might find something unsettling about a tradition that found God in a different register entirely. I told him I had not thought of it in quite those terms, and he said that was worth sitting with, because sometimes the thing we accuse others of getting wrong is the very question we ourselves are most afraid to examine honestly. I did not always live up to the patience that conversation asked of me. There were Sundays after that where I snapped at Ben in the car for no reason he had earned, where the real thing sitting on me was 30 minutes back down the highway at my mother's table. I am not going to pretend those 7 years turned me into someone tireless. What I can tell you is that I kept going back the following Sunday anyway, which is a smaller, more ordinary kind of faithfulness than this story might make it sound, and which turned out to be the only kind that actually holds. If you have ever nearly given up on a relationship you knew, somewhere underneath the exhaustion, you were not actually ready to let go of, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one, and I think more of us are standing at that exact fork than anybody admits out loud. Ben, for his part, grew quieter with my mother across that same stretch, not from anger, but from a slow, accumulating disappointment he did not yet have words for. Watching a woman he had tried hard to welcome into our family fail, again and again, at a kindness that should have cost her almost nothing. I noticed, without ever pointing it out, that he began finding small reasons to shorten our Sunday visits to Fenwick, and I asked him once, near the end of our 4th year, whether he had ever considered saying something to her directly. He told me he had drafted the conversation in his head more times than he could count, and had never once found the nerve, partly out of respect for the man he knew she genuinely was underneath the coldness, and partly out of fear that saying it plainly might force a confrontation neither of them was prepared to survive gracefully. I want to be fair to Ben in the telling of this, because it would be easy to make him sound passive across the whole span of these 7 years, and he was not. Not entirely. He learned to say something in the moment more often as the years went on, small corrections at first, gentle redirections when a comment started heading somewhere unkind, and by our 6th year, he had become the kind of husband who no longer needed me to point out a slight before he addressed it himself. I do not think that growth arrived all at once. I think it arrived the same slow, unglamorous way most real growth does, one small correction at a time, until one day he simply was the man standing beside me, rather than the boy still learning how. It was around that same season that my mother recruited an old family friend, a woman named Peggy Turner who had known me since I was in diapers, and who taught the ladies' Bible class alongside her at Fenwick, to have a quiet word with me about raising Caleb with a clear sense of what real worship looked like. Peggy came by for coffee one afternoon and asked, kindly enough, whether I ever worried Caleb might grow up confused about which kind of church actually followed Scripture. I told her no, not confused, simply loved in 2 different rooms of the same house, and Peggy did not really have an answer for that, and changed the subject to her tomato garden. I did not find out about that particular coffee visit until Caleb was already walking, and when I did, I was not angry at Peggy, who has turned out, strangely, to be one of the gentler voices in this whole story since. I was simply tired, the way you get tired of being discussed by people who have never once asked you a direct question themselves. Peggy's own husband, Elder Wade Turner, became one of the gentler voices in this story long before anyone else was ready to hear him. He had known my mother for over 30 years, and more than once, in front of me, I heard him tell her, gently, that Scripture gave plenty of room for disagreement about instruments among people who loved the Lord equally, and that he did not think certainty about a worship style was the same thing as certainty about a person's heart. My mother never fully agreed with him out loud, not for years, but I noticed she softened, slightly, whenever he said it, and I have decided that counts for something. I overheard one particular exchange between them myself, at a Fenwick potluck in our 5th year, standing near enough to catch most of it. My mother had said something offhand about hoping Caleb would eventually understand real worship once he was old enough to choose for himself, and Wade, setting down his plate, told her, plainly, Linda, you have been teaching that Bible class for 25 years, and I have never once heard you preach a sermon on instruments, because you know as well as I do that Scripture leaves room here that it does not leave in plenty of other places. I think you have let one small silence in the text grow a lot larger in your own heart than it was ever meant to be. My mother did not have an answer for him that day, and simply changed the subject to the potato salad, the same deflection I had watched her use on me more than once over the years, and I remember thinking it was strange and almost comforting to watch someone else receive the exact same evasion I had grown so used to myself. There was one incident from that stretch of years that came closer to true anger than anything else in this story. The summer Caleb turned 4, my mother signed him up, without asking either of us, for a week of Fenwick's Bible camp, and drove to our house on a Tuesday morning to collect him while I was at work, leaving a note on the counter that read, "Thought he would love this. Back by noon. Love Grandma." I came home to find the note instead of my son, and I want to tell you honestly that I sat down at that counter and cried before I ever got angry, because it was not the Bible camp itself that wounded me. It was the plain fact that some part of her still believed my permission on a matter like this was a courtesy rather than a requirement. Ben called her the moment I told him, and it was one of the very few times in this entire story I heard him truly raise his voice on a phone call, telling her plainly that whatever her intentions, she did not get to take our son out of our home without our knowledge. Not ever again, no matter how good the reason sounded to her. She apologized within the week, short and stiff, Nothing like the apology she would eventually give me years later at my own kitchen table, but real as far as it went, and she never did anything quite like it again. Caleb, for his part, came home from that morning happy, having made a craft with popsicle sticks and learned a new song, and asked me at dinner that night whether we had songs like that at our own church too, and I told him we had other kinds, and he accepted that answer the easy, unbothered way 4-year-olds accept almost anything, which made the whole episode feel both smaller and larger to me at once. What I did through all of it, and I want to say this without any pride, was mostly nothing dramatic. I did not write my mother a letter defending River City's worship style. I went to church every Sunday I was able. I prayed quietly at home most mornings, taught Caleb his own prayers in his own words, and showed up at every family gathering, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday, letting my own life, quietly, be the only real answer I had to give her. My father, through all of it, never once told me to pull back from my mother, and never once pushed her either. He came to River City himself, twice, quietly, without telling my mother beforehand either time, simply because he wanted to understand the world his daughter had built her family inside of. He told me, once, over coffee at his own kitchen table, that he found the fullness of the sound moving in its own way, though he would always love the particular weight of unaccompanied voices best, and that he did not believe those two things were actually in competition with each other, only different rooms in the same house of worship, and that he had never fully understood why his own wife could not yet see it that way too. The evening that changed everything came in the spring of our 7th year, and I did not see it coming at all. My mother had offered to babysit Caleb while Ben and I attended a rare weeknight dinner for his work, and she arrived nearly 20 minutes early, letting herself in the side door the way she has done since Caleb was born, and found me in the nursery, not yet aware she had arrived, praying over him quietly as he napped, the same ordinary prayer I said most afternoons, nothing performed, nothing meant for any audience at all. I did not hear her arrive. I did not know, until she told me weeks later, that she had stood in that hallway for the better part of 5 minutes, one hand resting on the doorframe, listening to a prayer with nothing behind it at all, no music, no raised hands, simply my voice, low and unremarkable, asking God to keep our son close, the same handful of words I have said over him most afternoons since he was born. She told me later she noticed, standing there, the particular quality of the quiet in that room, nothing at all like the busy fullness of a River City service, and yet, she said, something in the plainness of it reminded her so precisely of her own private prayers at her own kitchen table that she could not, for the life of her, locate the difference she had spent 7 years insisting must exist between us. This is the moment everything I told you about earlier finally comes back around, so stay with me. Before I show you what she heard, I want to ask you something. Has someone in your life ever measured your faith by its volume or its instruments, only to end up needing exactly what that quiet faith had been building in you the whole time? Tell me in the comments, and hit subscribe if this story has been worth your time so far, because what happens next is the reason I am telling it at all. She told me later she stood in the hallway for several minutes before I noticed her, listening to a prayer with no music behind it at all, no raised hands, no audience, simply a mother's voice asking God to keep her son close, over and over, in the same plain cadence I imagine she herself has used at Fenwick her entire life. She said she could not, in that moment, find a single thing in what she heard that sounded any different from what she believed real worship was supposed to sound like, and it unsettled something in her she had not expected. She did not say anything that evening. She simply hugged me goodbye when Ben and I left, longer than usual, and I did not think much of it until 3 weeks later. 3 weeks after that evening, Caleb, not yet 5, was riding in my mother's car on the way to get ice cream, and out of nowhere, unprompted, he recited an entire passage from the Psalms, word for word, the same one Ben and I read together most nights before bed. No music, no performance, simply a small boy repeating scripture he had absorbed the same quiet way children absorb everything, through repetition and love rather than instruction. My mother told me she had to pull the car over. She sat there, she told me later, staring at the steering wheel, while her grandson kept going, unbothered, straight into the next verse, and she said she could not find one single thing thin or careless about what she heard. A boy who had never once sat through a Fenwick service reciting scripture more fluently than some adults she had taught in her own Bible class for 20 years. She told me she asked him, gently, where he had learned it, and Caleb told her, simply, that Daddy and Mommy read it to him every night, and that he liked the part about the shepherd best, and went back to talking about what flavor of ice cream he wanted, entirely unaware of what he had just done to his grandmother. It was nearly a month later that she asked to come by my house alone, which she had never once done in 7 years. I made coffee. She held the cup in both hands a long while before she said anything at all. She told me, plainly, that she had spent 7 years believing a worship style without an instrument was the only one Scripture could account for, and that she had never once considered that the very thing she measured me against, quiet, unadorned, unaccompanied devotion, was exactly what she had overheard in my son's nursery that evening, with nothing at all behind it but a mother's plain voice. She said, "I stood at your rehearsal dinner and hoped out loud that you would build your marriage on worship Scripture could account for, and I meant it as a small correction, dressed up as a blessing, and I have thought about that sentence more than almost any other one since, because I heard the exact thing I said I wanted, given back to me in a hallway where I was never even supposed to be standing. I have replayed that rehearsal dinner more times over these past few weeks than I can count, wishing I could go back and simply welcome you and Ben instead, and finding, each time, that I cannot undo it, only try to become someone who would not say it again." She said, "I recruited Peggy to have a word with you, hoping she would tell you what real worship looked like, and Wade himself has told me for years that Scripture gives room for disagreement among people who love the Lord equally, and I did not want to hear either one of them, and I am ashamed it took a hallway and a car pulled over on the side of the road to finally believe what they had been telling me for years. I have gone back to Wade's words at that potluck more than once these past weeks, wondering how differently these 7 years might have gone if I had simply trusted his judgment the first time he offered it to me, instead of needing to arrive at it entirely on my own. She said, "I watched you kneel beside that crib and pray in the exact plain, unaccompanied way I have believed my whole life was the only real worship there is, and I could not find one single thing thin about it. I spent 7 years looking for the hollow place in your faith, Rachel, and I never found it, because it was never there to find. I only found, in the end, the hollow place in my own certainty, and it took a hallway I was never meant to stand in to finally see it clearly. I think, Rachel, some part of me always suspected that certainty of mine was thinner than I let myself admit, and it was simply easier, for 7 years, to keep pointing at your church instead of examining my own reflection." She said, "I was wrong about you, Rachel, not the small way you are wrong about a recipe or a route to town, but wrong about the whole shape of your heart, and I am asking you to forgive me, because you have loved me and my grandson every single day of these 7 years without once asking me to be anything other than exactly what I already was. I have rehearsed this conversation more times over these past weeks than I have rehearsed most Bible class lessons in 25 years, and I still do not feel entirely ready, but I have decided that waiting for readiness has already cost us 7 years, and I am not willing to let it cost us a single day more." I was crying by then, and I told her I forgave her, and we sat at that table for another hour, and before she left, she asked, quietly, whether she might come with me to River City sometime, just to see it for herself, honestly, without deciding in advance what she would find. I told her our door, and River City's doors, were open to her every single Sunday, and that I meant it exactly the same way I had meant it every year of the 7 that came before, only now, finally, she seemed ready to actually believe me. Ben found me in our own kitchen that same evening, after my mother had left, and told me he owed me his own apology, separate from hers, for 7 years of quietly letting comments slide past uncorrected, rather than risking a confrontation that might have actually protected me sooner. I told him I forgave him easily, because I understood exactly how much a lifetime of protecting a parent-in-law's feelings can cost a person's own nerve, and that I had never actually needed him to fight my mother for me, only to eventually stand beside me plainly, which I told him he had, in fact, been quietly doing all along, in his own patient, imperfect way. She came 2 Sundays ago. She sat in the third row, and during the second song, when the band came in fully and the whole room lifted together, I watched her close her eyes and her hands stayed folded in her lap the whole time, which I understood was as far as she was ever going to come, and it was more than enough. I watched her throughout that whole service the way I imagined she once watched me at my own wedding, except this time there was nothing careful or evaluating in her expression at all, simply a woman listening, genuinely, to something she had spent 7 years assuming she already understood well enough to dismiss. Afterward, in the parking lot, she asked if she could come back the following week too, because she said she could not stop thinking about the second song, the fullness of it, the way it had not once, in the entire service, felt like noise standing in for something real. She told me she had spent the whole drive over, rehearsing reasons she might find to leave early, and had not needed a single one of them. Here is where everyone stands now. My mother still believes, and always will, that there is something particular and precious about voices alone, unaccompanied, and she says so gently now, and I let her, because we have both learned you can love someone completely and still worship a little differently, and that difference was never actually the wall it looked like from the outside. Peggy and Wade Turner still come by most weeks, and Wade told me recently that watching my mother finally soften was one of the quiet joys of his last several years, having spent decades gently disagreeing with a woman he loved without ever once expecting to see her actually change her mind. My mother told Peggy the whole story herself, not long after her first Sunday at River City, sitting in Peggy's own kitchen over coffee, and Peggy told me later that my mother had cried through most of the telling, admitting that she had spent 7 years assuming a fuller sound must mean a thinner faith, and that she had been entirely wrong, that fullness and depth were never actually opposites at all. Peggy said the two women sat there a long while afterward, not saying much, simply letting the admission settle, and that it was one of the more remarkable conversations she has witnessed in 30 years of friendship with my mother. Wade himself told me, at a Fenwick potluck some months later, that he had waited over a decade for my mother to actually hear what he had been telling her all along, and that he had begun to wonder whether she ever would. He said watching her come home from her first Sunday at River City, quieter than usual, clearly turning something over, was one of the more hopeful things he had witnessed in his own long friendship with her, and that he had decided, that same week, to stop bringing up the subject of instruments with her entirely, since she had finally arrived somewhere he had spent years trying to point her toward, and there was no longer any argument left worth making. My father, for his part, has never once needed convincing of anything in this whole story, and he likes to remind us of that at every family gathering now, half joking, that he was on my side of things from the very first dance at my own wedding, and that it only took the rest of the family a hallway and a car pulled over on the side of the road to catch up to where he had been standing all along. My mother swats his arm every time he says it and tells him nobody likes a man who gloats, and he grins and pours himself more sweet tea, and I have come to understand that this particular teasing between them is its own small, ordinary kind of peace. Caleb is 11 now, and still recites scripture, the same unhurried way he did in that car, and my mother still tears up every time she hears it, on purpose now, because she has told me she has decided that particular kind of crying is one of the best things left in her life. He does not remember a single Sunday where his grandmother measured his mother's faith against her own, which is its own quiet miracle, since it means the years I lived inside will be nothing more to him, eventually, than a story his mother tells sometimes, the way you tell a child about weather that passed through long before he was born. He has started asking, lately, why Grandma keeps that old cassette tape in her kitchen drawer, and my mother tells him, every time, a little differently, always a bit harder on herself than she needs to be, about the years it took her to actually listen to what was in her own grandson's voice, and I let her, because I think she has earned the right to tell that part of the story, however she needs to tell it. Some Sundays now, Caleb asks if he can bring his Fenwick hymnal to River City with him, the same one my mother gave him as an infant, and sing along to the melody line without any instrument at all, weaving his own voice through the band's fuller sound. And I have decided that particular image, my son singing both traditions at once without ever once feeling he had to choose between them, is the truest picture of how this whole story actually ended. That is my story. 7 years, one overheard prayer, one small boy's borrowed scripture, and a wall that came down not because anyone argued it down, but because it simply had no reason left standing once she heard, with her own 2 ears, exactly what she had spent 7 long years insisting could never possibly be there at all. Ben says now, looking back, that he thinks the wall was never really about instruments at all, not on my mother's side, and not really on his own during the years he stayed quiet longer than he should have. He thinks it was always about fear wearing the costume of conviction, and that the only thing that ever actually undoes fear is time spent close enough to see it was never true. I want to leave you with what I have come to believe was the actual center of this whole story. If you are somewhere in the middle of your own version of it right now, loved carefully by someone who keeps measuring your faith against a sound it was never meant to make. You cannot argue your way past a lifelong conviction, and you cannot force a hallway or a car ride to arrive on a convenient schedule to prove your patience was worth something. What you can do, the only thing I ever actually did across 7 years, was keep living the plain, ordinary shape of your own faith in front of the person judging you at a careful distance, without resentment, without demanding they see you sooner than they were able to. I did not know, for 7 years, whether my mother would ever actually let herself hear what I already knew to be true about my own worship. I only knew that I still intended to be exactly who I already was, whether she was listening closely enough to notice or not, and it turned out, in the end, that was the only argument that was ever actually going to reach her. I think often about how close this story came to never reaching this particular ending. If my mother had arrived at our house exactly on time that evening instead of 20 minutes early, or if Caleb had been a few years older and less likely to recite scripture unprompted in the back seat of her car, I do not know how many more years this story might have stretched on without ever finding its turn. I do not say that to suggest the outcome was owed to us, because it was not. I say it only because I think it is worth being honest, that some walls do not come down through patience alone. Sometimes they require a moment neither side would ever have arranged, arriving at exactly the time it was needed, whether either of us was ready for it or not. I have wondered, more than once since, what might have happened if my mother had simply turned around in that hallway and left without ever mentioning what she overheard, the same way she had let so many other moments pass without comment across the previous 7 years. I do not have an answer for that. I only know she did not turn around, and that whatever finally kept her standing in that doorway a little longer than she needed to was not something either one of us fully controlled. I have come to believe that the 7 years of careful distance were never actually wasted, even though they felt, at the time, like a slow, ongoing loss with no end in sight. Every quiet morning prayer said before Caleb woke, every Sunday dinner where I answered a careful question honestly instead of walking away from the table, was its own small act of faithfulness, building, without my fully realizing it, toward a moment neither my mother nor I could have predicted or planned for. Faithfulness rarely announces which particular ordinary Tuesday it is actually preparing you for. It simply asks you to keep showing up, one dinner at a time, until the day finally arrives that needs exactly the person you have quietly been all along. I think, too, about the woman I became across those 7 years, and I do not say this with any pride, only with a kind of quiet astonishment, when I look back at who I was the first afternoon I brought Ben home to Fenwick, still certain, in the naive way you are certain in your early 20s, that warmth alone would eventually be enough to close any distance. It was not enough, not on its own, and I had to learn a harder, slower patience than I ever expected marriage would ask of me, the kind that does not announce itself as growth while it is happening, and only reveals its shape much later, in a hallway, listening to a woman finally hear something she had spent 7 years insisting could not be there. I think, in the end, about that cassette tape one more time, the one I asked you to hold on to at the very start of this story, My whole extended family singing a cappella at my grandfather's funeral 30 years ago. No instrument, just voices, layered and imperfect and somehow more beautiful for it. My mother still keeps it in that same kitchen drawer, and she played it for me again not long ago, sitting at her own table, and told me she had started to understand, finally, that what moved her so deeply about that recording was never actually the absence of instruments. It was the plainness of it, the nakedness of voices with nothing to hide behind, the exact same quality she heard, without expecting to, standing in a hallway outside her grandson's nursery, listening to a prayer that had nothing behind it either. I do not think either of us could have written that connection in advance. I only know the tape was always there, waiting, the whole time, for whatever it was eventually going to teach her. If you have ever been told your worship did not count the same way somebody else's did, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, because I believe there are far more of us than anybody around us realizes. And if this one meant something to you, share it with somebody who needs to hear that an ordinary, faithful life is still doing more work than it feels like most days. And if you have not subscribed yet, I would love to have you here for the next one.